And it had to now face the challenges of domestic survival. How do you pick up that slack? How do you prevent your economy and the quality of life of your people from going into a spasm? You will recall that during that time, I'm talking now about the 1980s, new ideological tendencies started sweeping all over Latin America. And in almost every Latin American country, governments that were right of center were replacing governments that were on the other side of the spectrum. Cuba's greatest challenge during this was exacerbated. Its challenge of its own internal survival was exacerbated by the effect of the embargo. Because here was a time when a new global environment where economics and not politics was what was defining economic activity, where many developing countries were trying to cash in on this boom time. And here was Cuba, without its traditional source of support, but not able to cash in on any of this boom simply because the embargo not only remained, but in some respects the embargo was in fact tightened. More recently, of course, Cuba has had to live not just with the US embargo, it has had to live with the European Union sanctions. To Cuba's credit, and this is very significant, faced with the constraints that were imposed on them by other circumstances, they took some strategic decisions. Priority number one became human development. Priority number two became human development. And they invested what little they could get their hands on to invest in the development of their people. And we've seen evidence of it in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of other critical areas of human development. And there's an advantage that they have built up for themselves which they have not been able up to now to fully exploit. But in time it's going to pay rich dividends for them. They now have a capacity build-up that if we were to just to look in the future and look perhaps post-embargo and look at a point in time which I know is going to come when they are going to become incorporated into the international community. They have this enormous capacity that is going to put them way ahead of the game in terms of developing the economy of Cuba. We have over time reevaluated our attitude to Cuba, not just since we became government. Certainly during the time when I was leader of the opposition, it is something that we have studied. We have interacted with representatives of the Cuban government based here, as well as representatives who visit the island from time to time. And we recognize a number of things. Firstly, what we experienced during the 1970s, which was in effect the exportation of the Cuban Revolution, because that, in a sense, was the broader ideological agenda and imperative of the time. We're satisfied that that exists no more. We're satisfied that that has given way to a verifiable, validatable acceptance of the principle of non-interference. And secondly, no one can ever dispute not just the extensiveness of Cuban assistance to Jamaica, but the genuineness of that assistance. Because here is a country that has its own internal resource problems. Here is a country that has been isolated by the US embargo. Here is a country that up until a few weeks ago was further isolated by European Union sanctions. Here was a country that had every excuse to say, I'd love to help you, but I can't. And yet in spite of that, they have been so generous in their generosity, not just to Jamaica, but to several other countries within the region. And as I've said before, to to be doing this without any strings attached, because there has been no attempt to use this to influence, to sway political thinking in any way. I want to say a word about the U.S. embargo. Whatever may have been its historical justification, and I'm not entering upon that discussion, it has got to a point where currently it has no usefulness whatsoever. The impracticability of it is so glaringly obvious. If it was designed to punish, we should by now recognize that the Cubans have borne and will no doubt forever continue to bear that punishment with pride and defiance. If it was intended, if it was designed to coerce Cuba into some kind of reform, some sort of change, it is clear that after 50 years it has not happened. And the chances of it ever happening, in my view, do not even exist. I find too that it is not just impractical, but it is in many respects inexplicable, because it stands as a stark inconsistency with U.S. policy towards other countries. I've had discussions with U.S. officials and I've asked them to explain to me. I said, look, I'm shallow in understanding, so walk me through this one. You invest in Cuba, in China, you trade with China. China is regarded as an important country with whom you have relations. There are 4 countries in the world that still proclaim communism as its political ideology: Cuba, China, Vietnam, North Korea. There's significant levels of American investment in Vietnam. Vietnam is communist. Vietnam continues to be a source of concern to the United States in terms of political freedoms. Quite recently, the U.S. ambassador in Vietnam was calling on the Vietnam government to release political prisoners. But you have a U.S. ambassador there. They're investing money in Vietnam. There's no such relation with North Korea, not so much because of North Korea's communism, but because of North Korea's nuclear capability and the possibility that North Korea could decide to exercise that capability in a particular way. And therefore I ask the question, explain to me what justifies embargo, alienation in one case, but constructive involvement in another.